Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. Last year, more than 650,000 people in America were identified as being without permanent shelter, and that's a record number, the most since counts were started in 2007, and it's a 12% increase over 2022. Oregon has double what would be the national average of people without a permanent place to call home. In this episode, Tawnya Layne explores why so many are homeless in Oregon and possible short-term and long-term solutions.
Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement that has housed people experiencing homelessness for over 90 years, told us to pull people out of the river and then give hell to the ones who push them in. In today's episode, I'll take a close look at the current epidemic of homelessness in the United States and walk upstream to find out who's pushing these folks in the river and why. I sought to understand the social and economic dynamics that have resulted in the exponential growth of the homeless population in the United States and why a disproportionate percentage of those folks are people of color. I answer these questions and more in the following episode of Human Rights Magazine. The number of people experiencing homelessness has increased steadily since the 1980s as a result of federal policy decisions affecting the availability of affordable housing. 653,000 Americans were counted in HUD's 2023 Annual Homelessness Assessment Report, which was a record high. In the United States, people of color make up a much larger share of the homeless population than they do of the general population. Indigenous people especially are far more likely to experience homelessness. Nearly every city has places where people experiencing homelessness gather. The Willow Creek Camp in Madras, Oregon, is on the north end of town closest to the Warm Springs Reservation. The creek runs most of the year, and the willows screen the camp from the bustle of town. Safeway is across the street. As far as homeless encampments go, it's ideal, and this one has been home to a rotating cast of indigenous folks for the better part of a decade. On June 11, 2024, the city of Madras began a sweep of the camp, an eviction of sorts. On the day of the sweep, I parked nearby to observe. There were several police vehicles and a city official in a crisp white dress shirt and tie. At 9 a.m., they made their way down to the camp to officially begin the sweep. After a few minutes, residents of the camp began making their way to the parking lot. I caught up with an older indigenous gentleman walking away from the camp. Gibson,
Mitchell. Gibson's first name, Mitchell's last.
Can I use your name or do you want me to change it?
No, it's all right.
Use it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not ashamed of it.
No, you
I'm
shouldn't
proud.
be. You shouldn't be. So,
I lived this long, I could, with it, so
Yeah.
I could keep on going until I die.
yeah, how old are you, Gibson?
69,
Yeah.
I believe.
I was thinking, is that what that says?
Yeah.
When were you in the hospital recently? You are
Well,
69.
not very long ago.
Ah.
Yeah, 69.
So how long has this camp been here? It's been a long time.
Oh, yeah.
Like how long
Well,
do you think?
first we was way over there underneath the trestle.
Yep, I remember.
And then we moved this way and was on the hillside.
Yep.
And then railroad company made us move out of there.
Oh my God.
That's why we're down here in the Willow Creek now.
So has it been 10, 20 years?
Yeah, we're gonna have to move from there too, I guess.
Yeah, you are.
I got a tent.
I know, you got your place.
Yeah, actually it's 2 tents.
Yeah,
One tent inside of another.
yeah,
And then tarp over the front for my porch.
yeah. You got it set up.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's more
Moving because there's some that's got bigger tents than I got. Like my sister, she's got a big tent and a tent inside a tent, and then spots it over where she's even got a couch in there.
Oh, wow.
And then her tent with a big queen size bed.
Oh, she's set.
Yeah, and then there's another fold-out bed, and we're in a outside of her tent, but it's still covered like a tent.
What the city viewed as a nuisance was for him home. The city would rather have him stay at a 27-bed homeless shelter which was recently built near the encampment by Jefferson County Faith-Based Network at a cost of $4.3 million, which amounts to $160,000 per bed. The local churches involved seek to assist marginalized, disadvantaged, and vulnerable populations. The shelter provides dinner and a warm bed from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m., breakfast, and a sack lunch. When asked if he would sleep in the shelter that night, Gibson said no. He told me he'd spent a night there once before and was vague about why he wouldn't go back. He'll set up his home somewhere else. I spoke with Tony Mitchell, Executive Director of the Jefferson County Faith-Based Network, who was instrumental in building the new emergency shelter. Faith-based groups provide most of the emergency shelter beds in the United States. I wanted to learn why 75% of the people who access his shelter are indigenous, when the indigenous population of the city is only 10%.
Well, I think some of what I described, Tanya, without being pejorative at all, of kind of the life besetting, barriers and challenges, that we have folks that are within the reservation is within our county. And there's a lot of services and a lot of opportunities on the reservation, but sometimes due to challenges, let's say, with drug and alcohol usage and that sort of thing, it's not consistent with what is allowed or permitted on the reservation. So you find people making their way by choice, I'll be honest with you, into Madras out of the reservation. And they're residing homelessness. So you have a combination, quite honestly, of people who are houseless by choice and those that are houseless by need and circumstances. And
to say that there are a lot of services and opportunities on the Warm Springs Reservation is in stark contrast to the reality faced by people living there. According to the Warm Springs Community Action Team website, challenges facing people on the reservation include a lack of affordable housing, poor infrastructure, the absence of living wage jobs, the poor state of the local economy, the virtual absence of thriving small businesses, low educational attainment, and wide-ranging public health and public safety issues. The poverty rate is twice that in the rest of Oregon, and a third of families live on less than $25,000 per year. To learn more, I spoke with Sarah Sadian, the Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Field Organizing at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, an advocacy group focusing on the needs of extremely low-income people.
The 30s, but certainly it's clear that starting in about the 80s, HUD's budget was dramatically cut, and we've just never recovered. And that really corresponds to the increase in homelessness, this modern phenomena of homelessness that we see. And that's because for decades now, the federal government hasn't been investing the resources that it needs to in building housing that's affordable to those households that are most at risk of homelessness. So it's very easy for people to, when you make such low incomes, it's very easy to fall behind on your rent, and maybe you miss a couple days of work, maybe your car breaks down, and all of a sudden you're evicted from your home, and in worst cases, you're experiencing homelessness.
Right. So that brings me to something I've been wondering. That drop in the federal investment in public housing occurred, within a decade of the civil rights movement. And part of me wonders, was it a pushback, a racial pushback? That's when we started hearing all, the Reagan year talk about welfare queens, etc. I wonder how much of it consciously or subconsciously was a pushback against the civil rights movement.
I definitely think there's a connection there to racial discrimination and systemic racism in our housing markets and other markets. There are a lot of those factors happening at the same time, where you saw, for example, the federal government around that time was, through the GI Bill and through other bills, was helping white families become homeowners in the suburbs, leaving behind, a highly concentrated poverty among people of color. You're also seeing, over that same time period, this racialized stigma against people who are in need of federal assistance or receiving federal assistance. Like, this trope of the welfare queen is heavily saturated in racial stereotypes and biases, and that turns the public and also elected officials against the sort of funding increases and the funding that's needed to up. We sort of hit on it before, but I think it's always worth pointing out that because of historic and ongoing discrimination in the housing market and employment markets and other sort of sectors, we see disproportionate harm to Black and indigenous and other people of color in the rental market, and they are vastly overrepresented when it comes to people experiencing homelessness. And so if we care deeply about advancing racial equity, we have to recognize how important affordable housing is to that goal.
I began to wonder about the impact of the Victorian notion of the deserving and undeserving poor on the homeless response. So I spoke with Mary Frances Kenyon, Vice President of Training and Technical Assistance at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. How does meritocracy factor into our unwillingness to fund care for folks who need it?
It is an issue, but I think it's one of deflection. I think that is an intentional. I think that's an intentional approach that we've adopted as a society, as an alternative to holding poorly designed systems accountable. It's so much easier to focus on an individual and deflect to, well, these group of individuals have done this, therefore they are not deserving, as opposed to questioning why it is that in certain communities, folks don't have access to a well-paying job, or a quality place to live, or transportation, or why there are food deserts that exist in certain communities, or why there isn't adequate health care for people to be able to be whole and heal and support themselves. I think the meritocracy is definitely an issue, but I think it's one that absolutely deflects from how systemic these problems are. And I feel like systemic problems need to have systemic solutions.
Do you consider houselessness a racial justice issue?
Absolutely, hands down. The data continue to show us the disproportionate representation, particularly of people who identify as Black, as Indigenous, as Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. But we're also seeing some disproportionate representation in the last set of national level data that is a growing concern for Latino households, and also those households who identify as Asian or Asian American. There's always a challenge talking about racial justice, because oftentimes the instinctive question is, well, what about? And what about this group? What about that group? But I think what's important to kind of keep front and center is that across every other marginalized group, you will continue to see persistent racial disparities. So those racial and ethnic disparities across every minoritized group, whether it's folks in a rural community, whether it's members of the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+ population, socioeconomic status, whatever factor you're looking at, there's going to continue to be disparities. that impact those groups that I just mentioned. So this is absolutely a racial justice issue. And
instead of putting resources into building deeply affordable public housing, many communities have increasingly criminalized homelessness through camp sweeps and making it illegal to sleep, sit, or even eat in public spaces, despite the absence of adequate alternatives. The Grants Pass versus Gloria Johnson case decided by the Supreme Court in June 2023 reinforces the criminalization of homelessness. Gloria Johnson faced citation for camping in a park and was prohibited from sleeping in her van. She claimed that municipal codes such as these violate the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, since there were no low-barrier shelters she could access in Grants Pass. Sarah Sadian weighed in on this issue.
Certainly, as homelessness has increased, especially unsheltered homelessness, which is much more visible, you see elected officials feeling enormous pressure to respond to homelessness in their communities, but too often they're turning to measures that aren't actually effective at solving homelessness. It maybe moves people from one encampment to another encampment, but ultimately doesn't solve for their homelessness. And I feel like a lot of times elected officials want to pretend or they want to look like they're doing something on homelessness when in fact they're really only making the problem worse, because if we're not giving people an exit out of homelessness, then the number of people who are experiencing homelessness continues to grow because more people are coming in and people aren't exiting, right? And so what we really need is the political will to invest resources at the scale that's needed to ensure that everybody, but especially people with the lowest incomes, those who are the most marginalized, have an affordable, accessible place to live. And that only happens if we're all advocates are working together to put pressure on elected officials to call for the resources to demand that we are finally investing at the scale that's needed.
Right. It became clear to me that federal disinvestment in public housing is one of the primary drivers of homelessness. The stigmatization of public housing as monstrous, depressing places, run down, overcrowded, and crime-ridden, as President Richard Nixon said in 1973, was intentional and racially motivated. This stigmatization resulted in the passage of the Faircloth Amendment in 1998, which prevents the federal government from ever maintaining more public housing than was available in 1999. The United States has 63 million more people today than it did then. But repealing the Faircloth Amendment is only half the battle. Any long-term solution must involve a federal commitment to fully fund public housing authorities so they can maintain safe, accessible, and affordable public housing for the people who need it. Sarah Sadian agrees.
Income households, the only way to really serve them is if the federal government is stepping in to provide resources. And that's because it's a problem that can't be solved just through the private sector. You have to have public subsidies in order to serve those households. And the problem is national in scope. Every single community is dealing with a shortage of housing for extremely low-income households. So national in scope means that we really have to have a national solution.
Instead of a strong, coordinated national solution, we've treated a decades-old problem like a natural disaster, using FEMA funds and a patchwork of grants to build emergency shelters. But even as we see the increase in those beds in the last few years, people are not necessarily accessing them for a number of reasons. The paternalistic attitude of staff, separation from pets and partners, and a cold institutional feel. But the main reason is that people want a home of their own. But a long-term problem requires a long-term solution. That solution is deeply affordable public housing. This isn't a crisis we can shelter our way out of. We've got to permanent housing our way out of it. Emergency shelters are the equivalent of putting a Band-Aid on someone with a chronic disease. It feels like care, but it's not really helping. Half of the beds at the new shelter in Madras are empty most nights. For the folks who were camped at Willow Creek, their campsite is their home, be it ever so humble. For all of us, home is where your stuff is, where you can let your guard down and relax out of the public eye. When asked what they would do with the $4.3 million spent on the shelter on the hill, residents of the camp told me they would build a mansion, a house big enough for each of them to have their own room. What people want is a space and a place to call their own. Kenyon summarized the issue well.
The lack of investment in deeply affordable housing for our extremely low-income renters out there, it's at crisis proportions. It really is, and we've got to act swiftly. If everyone had a safe, accessible, affordable home, we might not need to invest so much into our homeless response system, because that would be sort of an upstream prevention strategy. If we can eliminate the people that are falling into homelessness just because they can't afford a place to live, that would do our country a lot of justice. I mean to say, but those that are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions, which is a given. But how do we return power to people that have been historically minoritized and excluded from every aspect of society, from policy making to decisions, to funding, to even just being present for conversations and contributing to them? So we've got a whole lot of work to be done, but homelessness is absolutely a racial justice issue. And if we can figure out ways in which to solve for the racial justice issues, we might be able to solve for homelessness overall for everyone.
Less than 6 months after the opening of the emergency shelter nearby, Willow Creek is slated to become a city park next to a trail system. The bathrooms and garbage service would have made living there more tenable for the people who called it home. The sweep comes in the wake of a long history of displacing Black and brown people, of gentrifying neighborhoods, of taking power out of the hands of the poor.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.